What's the one image that you associate with Quakers? Or product? Yeah.
Oatmeal?
Yeah. Why do we associate that with Quakers? Because there's one on the box, right? What would be the second one? It was just oatmeal because there's the guy. I think there's a Liberty Bell too on it, isn't there? Which makes sense because Philadelphia. Maybe oil, Quaker State oil. Quaker State is what state?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, right. And it's named after a very famous Quaker, William Penn, who we'll talk about in a moment. Why are we talking about these guys in terms of being Quakers rather than the Society of Friends, which is their official name? I mean, they don't mind. If you ask somebody who is in the Society of Friends, what's your denomination, they'll quite often say we're a Quaker, because that's what most people understand. If they say, well, we're friends, you might think, oh, I've got friends too. That doesn't quite make the same impact, right? They were called Quakers in part because they would said, we're worried about God. They get hauled into court. Your book tells you, one of these little funny stories about this. They get hauled into court for all sorts of reasons, and they wouldn't obey the magistrate. And back then, that was big stuff, because nowadays, if you get held in contempt of court, what do they do to you? I hope none of you have ever been held in contempt of court. But what's the most they're going to do to you? They'll throw you in jail, right? That's what you get for contempt of court. Maybe a fine, if it wasn't too bad. Back then, it could be like a whipping, or, if they threw you into jail back then, it was not like jails now. Jails back then were almost a death sentence in many cases. Diseases were rampant, conditions were just horrible. They could do all sorts of things. So these people saying, we're not going to take our hats off in court, that was really taking a stand. And the magistrate would say, look, I'm going to give you a chance. Take your hat off, or it's whipping time. They wouldn't quite say it like that, but you get the idea. And they would say, no, we're going to shake, or we're going to fear before God. We're going to quake. That's what it means to quake, is to have the shakes, to be afraid. And they would say, you ought to be afraid of God. I'm not afraid of you. You're just a magistrate. You're just a man. You can't really do anything to me. That was very bold. And that's where their name came from. The ones who are literally afraid before God. There's something like that, by the way, for Jews. The Haredi literally means those who are afraid before God, those who fear God. So the Quakers are coming out of the English branch of the Reformation. And where did I put my pen? Once the Reformation happened, just a little bit of review, we get the Church of England, right? And from last class, do you remember who their big, if this was a comic book, who their big enemies would be? The Church of England would be like the Empire, who would be the rebellion, if this was Star Wars terminology. One of the people that one of the groups of people that we talked about before. They came over, they had to get out of Dodge, because anyone remember?
Puritans.
Very good. So you got the Church of England on one side, and you've got the Puritans, aided and abetted by Presbyterians and a few other things on the other side. And eventually, there's other things involved, of course, but you get a civil war. And when a country devolves into civil war, you have a lot of chaos. You can think about what happened after the invasion in modern-day Iraq, right? You had a very strong totalitarian regime. United States, with a few allies, came in, took him out. And did things go back to normal right away? No, they're still not completely back to normal. There's different factions, a lot of violence. Sometimes getting rid of one power structure opens up the door for a lot of chaos. And that doesn't just involve politics. Remember, these people at that time were very interested in matters of religion. So your book talks about a number of different, what are called sects arising. It gives you some examples of some of the biggest ones. The ranters, who are pantheists, that means that they believe that God can be found in everything. The diggers who advocated communal ownership of land on religious grounds, not going to fly with traditional Anglicans or Puritans. They're not going to go for that. The Muggletonians, who claim to be the two witnesses of the book of Revelation, the fifth monarchy men who were saying that the millennium is here. We're going to talk about millennial movements a little bit later on. When there's chaos, quite often people will come on the scene and say, it's the end of the world. And often they'll turn to what are called the apocalyptic books of the Bible, and start talking about prophecies, and people start having visions. So there was a lot of that going on. At the same time, you also had people out there called seekers. And seekers were interested in trying to figure out, well, which of these are actually right, or if none of them are right, what would be right? What would be authentic Christianity? Remember, at this time, you now have a lot of different competing voices. It's not just Protestants versus Catholics. It's Protestants versus other Protestants, all of whom are claiming that they are the ones who really know how Christianity ought to be lived, thought about, practiced, organized. So that leads to people who, in philosophical terms, we would call these skeptics, because the original skeptics means seekers. The skepticoi, those who are looking for something else. And if you're looking for meaning, religious meaning in your life, maybe some of you have had, periods like this in your life, where you grew up in one tradition and you said, this really isn't doing it for me. I don't want to get rid of religion altogether. I want to find something that will actually be suited to me. How might you do that? What sort of things what sort of means could you pursue? Do you know any people like that who are looking? They don't know. They don't think they have the answer yet, but they think the answer's out there. What might you do? Yeah.
I mean, you can travel to different countries.
That's a good idea. Tougher now because travel is kind of expensive. When I was a college student, things were much cheaper. It's kind of sad for you guys because you don't have the same opportunities in many respects. But that's a great idea. Try out other cultures. Rene Descartes says that travel is as good as going to school. And he's a guy who actually went to a lot of school. He went to university, then to law school, medical school. And he says travel is as good as reading books because you get to see the customs of other people. You get to try on their way of life. Yeah.
And most of the time, all of the people you are surrounded with aren't of the same culture. So if you ever, not hang out, but follow their culture, if you would do something with them.
Yeah, it's like trying on. This is going to be kind of facetious. It's like trying on a new way of clothing, right? At first, it doesn't fit really well, and you're like, I don't know how people live like this. But then after a while, it starts to feel comfortable, and you're like, oh, it's nice to have pockets here. I'd never had that. This is a real advantage. And you can go on and on and on. We could make all sorts of analogies like that. But you're right. And in religion, it wouldn't be necessarily going to other countries. It'd be going to other people's churches. I know quite a few people who will go, this church on this weekend, this church on this weekend, and you ask them, what are you doing? I'm looking for something that will fit me. How do you know that it fits you, though? It'd be awfully handy if there was like a sign, that you walk in and ding, this is the church for you. But that rarely happens. Yeah.
Would you find enjoyment in it?
Yeah, you would look for whether you find joy, whether you find peace, whether you find all these sorts of things that traditionally people would talk about in Christianity. Now this guy, George Fox, it's a shame that the book doesn't really talk about his wife at all, because she was also very important in this movement. He's one of these seekers. Like your book says, he became impatient with external forms of religion, began to teach that the truth could be found most purely within each individual, including himself. And he's looking for something like that, a kind of response, something that would say, yes, this is the right way. He talks about his followers, and it also talks about this sort of prophetic incident where he's going into town and preaching. And eventually, he thinks that he's latched onto something that makes complete sense out of everything. And this he calls the inner light. This is still something very central to Friends or Quakers today. This notion that there's an inner light, and I should put this underneath, inside everyone. Every single person can be the temple of God. Every single person could have a revelation from God or the Holy Spirit speaking within them. And now if you have this sort of view, like it says in the text, this light, which is the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit of Christ, is the ultimate authority in matters of religious truth, and is to be cultivated and followed by all friends in the context of the meetings for worship. So this is sort of like, remember how we talked about the Pope, with Catholics, is where the buck stops. If there's like some sort of dispute, I mean, that's traditionally the function of the Pope, is to say, we're coming down on this side. It's not like he, sits in the Vatican and says, what can I be infallible about today? Let me think of something to talk about. It only happens once in a very long while that he'll make some sort of important pronouncement like that. This is sort of like each person being their own Pope. Being, God's emissary. So this is pretty revolutionary, isn't it? Think about the Church of England, right? There you've got a lot of order and structure. They've decided we're going to keep this. They have bishops. Imagine you were a bishop or a priest at the time in the Church of England, and you've got these people who are going around in your town and saying, yeah, I've got this inner light, and it says that these other guys are full of it, and we don't have to listen to them. And they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to Scripture or God. Really, we just each have to follow our own individual light, because that's how God is going to talk to us. You might not like that, right? You might say, these guys are troublemakers. And that's what happened. I mean, the Quakers were not popular among Anglicans, nor among the Puritans, nor among quite a few of the other sects. It talks about, some of the trouble that they got into. Some of it was caused just by their insistence on seeing everybody as equals. We don't use terms like, I suppose I should put this on the board as well. Thee and thou, right? Thine. What else goes with that? Thee, thou, thine. Do you know why they used that at the time? In English, as we teach it today, we use a different word for this, right? We use you, and that can be the object or the subject. You is actually the second person plural in English. We just use it, for everybody, individual or plural. But back in their day, you would address somebody who you knew quite intimately with the second person singular, thee, and you would address other people more formally with you. That's why you caught on. How many of you have studied German or French? I don't know if Spanish has this sort of thing. Any of you have studied French? So it's like saying tu to another person in French. You don't do that with anybody off the street, because they would think that you're being rude. And there are certain classes of people you wouldn't do that with. If you were in the court of law, even if you knew the judge, you wouldn't use tu with them. In German, it's du, right? You wouldn't use du. I think they call it to duten somebody. just like tutoyer in French, you would use ihr, which is a different pronoun. Well, it was the same way in English. So to use thee and thou was very informal, very intimate. To do this with the authorities was really asking for trouble. It would be sort of like walking into a courtroom and saying, "Hey, judge, how's it hanging?" I hope none of you would do that in the courtroom today, because that would get you in trouble. It was all these sorts of things, this insistence on sort of leveling distinctions, on equality, on holding to individual judgment that tended to get them in a lot of trouble. And that's probably a good place to sort of segue into why they wound up in Pennsylvania. So your book talks about George Fox, and then it also talks about William Penn. And Penn is a convert. He's not a Quaker originally, but he becomes a Quaker. And it just so happens that he holds some debts that the British monarchy owes. And, you could buy a lot of things with debts, but it's kind of hard to settle them. You could say, well, I want some ships, or I want many bales of cotton, or things like that. What he said is, I'd like this tract of land over here. And that's what we nowadays know as Pennsylvania. Pretty big tract of land, isn't it? Penn is his name, and Sylvania is the Latin word for forest. So it was Penn's forest. And what he did is he said, all right, the Puritans up north, they're only letting Puritans in. And if you're not fitting in there, you got to go over to Rhode Island. And further south, it's all Anglicans, and they're not treating other people, as well as they should either. Why don't I create a spot where anybody can go, and there won't be any established church, and it'll be safe for everyone to pursue their own relationship with God. That's what he did. And he went beyond that. Your book talks about him going out to trips, in Germany, in the Rhine Valley, where you had a lot of these sectarians. That's part of why the Amish and the Mennonites and some of these other groups came to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was sort of like the Ellis Island for nonconformist Protestants, those who didn't fit in. The Ellis Island before Ellis Island. And then from there, they fanned out into other places. A lot of these smaller groups went across the Midwest into Ohio and Indiana. Now he talks about, the text talks about some of the issues that came about a little bit later. I want to backtrack and focus on services. Have any of you ever been to a Friends or Quaker service? No? They'll let you in. They're very welcoming. You might think it's a little strange if you're used to other kinds of religious services, because a good portion of it, you might think they're actually, just meditating, because it's quiet, they're sitting. Some services, it could go with nobody saying anything. Why? Yeah.
Yeah, one of our friends, she went to Penn Charter in Pennsylvania, and so they had to do that every Thursday for school, and she said that, God is supposed to, speak to you, and then you say what, He wants you to say.
Yeah, that's this notion of the inner light. And, you could see that maybe this could lead to certain abuses if somebody's, given to claiming that God is speaking to them. But for the most part, this doesn't turn out to be a big problem. If God says something like, I want everybody to give me your wallets, probably not God, right? But what they'll do is they'll wait for a prompting of the inner light. They'll wait for God to speak to them. And if God doesn't speak during the entire service, well, then, try again next time. And they'll go back and forth. This is also how they handle business within the church, within the ecclesial community. They try to come to consensus on things. They try to talk things out. They're very devoted to dialogue rather than conflict. And this runs throughout their entire ethos. Now, to go back to Pennsylvania, one of the things that your book talks about, which is why there are different groups of Quakers out there, has to do with adaptation to other religious groups, and another dynamic too that we saw with the Puritans. If you're living a kind of ascetic lifestyle, you're not spending a lot of money on frivolous things like drink. Remember going out to the bars costs you money. If you want to be rich, you can't go to the bar all the time unless you've already made it rich. They're not spending a ton of money on clothes. They're not spending a ton of money on luxury items, and they work very hard. So one of the key areas, Philadelphia. Nowadays, we think of Philadelphia, and we think of the Liberty Bell and Philly cheesesteaks, and perhaps that show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which I'm a big fan of, by the way. Even though I probably shouldn't be. It's totally nihilistic. Philadelphia means city of brotherly love. Adelphos is brother. Philos means love. And Quakers, or Friends, were among the people who founded it. And, when you found a city, you generally end up being pretty important in the city. And quite a few of them ended up becoming fairly prosperous. And your book talks about some tensions that came about in this. Whenever you start to get rich, there's a tendency to, make distinctions between people. Better church pews. In this case, like your book talks about, they would wear the same kind of clothes, but some would be made of much better material, some less material. And when you have a case like that, along will come somebody like Elias Hicks, who's calling for a return to original Quaker values. You can think of this as like a Reformation within the Reformation. And he emphasized the inner light tradition, which he thought was being sort of downplayed and left out. As the Quakers in Philadelphia were becoming more and more prosperous, they were also starting to look an awful lot more like the other Protestants. And they were looking less and less like the original Quakers. So like it says, this resulted in a split of the Quaker community into Orthodox, or the older ones, and Hicksite fashions. Now, your book also says this is only the beginning. Other splits took place. The Quakers, Philadelphia is it's right on the eastern seaboard. Pennsylvania is a long state, isn't it? They're moving west. And as they're moving west, this is a very important dynamic that we're going to look at. Not every religious group or community transports well. Do you know what I mean by that? When I say it doesn't transport well, sort of like, beer and wine and whiskey. Nowadays we have great logistics. It's easy to transport anything anywhere. Do you know why whiskey was such a big thing in the Old West? It was the one liquor that you could actually transport that wouldn't get shaken up so much and lose a lot of its quality. Couldn't do that with beer. Wine, not so much either. That's why they grew wine in California. Whiskey you could transport. Certain religious forms don't transport very well. If you need an educated clergy and you need very structured church traditions, that's not going to be very easy to take out to the American frontier. And a large part of Pennsylvania was the American frontier for decades. The Quakers, along with the Methodists, the Baptists, they were the people who were easy to take out there. Because, if all you have to do is wait for the inner light, or preach the gospel, or, as we're going to talk about with the Methodists, try to awaken this sanctification experience, that's pretty easy to take along. And the Quakers found themselves getting more and more like some of these other groups. So it led to another split between those who were sort of followers of Gurney and those who were followers of Wilbur And you don't need to know that much about these particular guys as individuals. It's more what they represent. Gurney represented this more evangelical, like the other denominations, like the Baptists, like the Methodist emphasis. Wilbur was once again sort of like Hicks, saying, you guys don't lose your roots. Don't lose what makes you distinctive. And Quakers started splitting into different groups. Nowadays, there's, like your book talks about, there's 3 main groups. And we'll talk more about them in a later chapter. And then there's a few smaller groups. There are not many Quakers left. They have not aged well as a denomination. But they were extremely important in early American religious history.